When it comes to Godzilla, there's a lot to go through. So we decided to focus on 3 particular films to identify what Godzilla represents and one of the major reasons why the big radioactive lizard has endured for so long. First, a minor history lesson. The story begins with Toho. They're a Japanese film studio, and without them, there'd be no Godzilla. The studio has become synonymous with Godzilla, but other than distributing some Akira Kurosawa films or Studio Ghibli films, around the world Toho is chiefly known as the premier producer of kaiju monster movies. But before they gained that reputation, something pretty significant happened to Japan. In August of 1945, American forces bombed both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Varying reports suggest that the bombings led to roughly 200,000 civilian deaths in the months that followed. After the peace treaty was signed, America continued testing thermonuclear bombs off the coast of the Marshall Islands for nearly 2 decades, and the constant emission of radiation led to some unexpected consequences. In March of 1954, just 8 months before the release of Godzilla, a nuclear test had gone off twice as powerful as expected, causing fallout to drift out of the danger zone and into Japanese waters. The crew of a Japanese fishing boat, Lucky Dragon No. 5, encountered the fallout, and upon their return to shore, all 23 members were hospitalized while they endured the terrible effects of acute radiation sickness. Which is a real bummer, but what does this have to do with Godzilla? Well, everything. That was the first time the world heard Godzilla's roar, and it makes for one hell of an introduction. Ishiro Honda wrote and directed the first entry in the Godzilla franchise, and it's one of the most poignant and subtle films to date. You see, on the surface, the first Godzilla film follows a fairly simple storyline. It's about a paleontologist trying to convince the Japanese military not to use excessive force to kill this 160-foot-tall abomination that's been awoken by American nuclear testing. This paleontologist is starting to worry that the old legends about Godzilla might be true. And despite a pretty convincing PowerPoint, no one believes him. Offshore fishing boats keep disappearing mysteriously, and the public starts pleading with the government for an explanation. The government tries to placate and dismiss them, but eventually that's just not possible. Godzilla goes on to terrorize the city, destroying anything and anyone in his path. The government organizes an anti-Godzilla task force and they launch everything at him, but Godzilla doesn't seem to notice. Eventually, one of the characters learns about a scientist who's accidentally created a device that could be used as a weapon of mass destruction. It's the only thing that has a chance against defeating Godzilla, but he's hesitant to use it because this power in the wrong hands could be devastating. This is an obvious reference to Oppenheimer, the man who created the atomic bomb and would lament it for the rest of his life.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
There's some arguing about whether or not the scientist should be the one to use the weapon himself, but eventually he does, sacrifices himself, and defeats Godzilla. That's the story on the surface, but if you look just one layer deeper, you can see what Hondo was really trying to say. Consider that the movie was released less than 10 years after World War II, and the symbolic imagery of Godzilla being an atomic bomb is unmistakable. The final line of the film sums up Honda's ideals the most directly.
もし水爆実験が続けて行われるとしたら、あのゴジラの同類がまた世界のどこかへ現れてくるかもしれない。
The massive financial success of the first film quickly led to some misguided attempts to continue the story, and in 1962, the quintessential Godzilla movie was released upon the world. King Kong vs. Godzilla is fun and ridiculous, but it doesn't really say anything. It's just Godzilla fighting another giant monster, and that's what Godzilla movies turned into for the next 22 years. He fought Mothra, King Ghidorah, Rodan, and a bunch of other kaiju, and any subtext in a Godzilla film was thrown out the window. And why the hell not? Godzilla's awesome. The Godzilla franchise is notorious for retconning, and the first example of that was in 1984 with The Return of Godzilla. This movie was a sequel to the first film, and it ignored everything in between. No complaints here, it's a great movie. This was the first time he actually represented something since the original entry in the franchise. The Second Cold War had kicked off with the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, and it was in full swing by the early 80s. With tensions mounting between Russia and America, the threat of nuclear war was looking more possible than ever, and Toho once again turned to their greatest damnation of nuclear war by revisiting Godzilla. The special effects supervisor from many of the first Godzilla films had this to say. We went back to the theme of nuclear weapons since that was the theme of the original film. Japan had now learned 3 times what a nuclear disaster is, but the problem was that Japanese society was gradually forgetting about these disasters. They were forgetting how painful it had been. Everyone in Japan knew how scary nuclear weapons were when the original movie was made, but it wasn't like that in the 1980s, so we decided to remind all those people who had forgotten. The return of Godzilla starts with a Russian sub getting destroyed in the Pacific, and they immediately blame the Americans for it. The Japanese quickly quash that rumor when they get photographic evidence that Godzilla has returned. Sure, the Americans and the Russians have a Cold War going on, but Godzilla's a living nuclear weapon, and he's right outside of Japan. Once again, Godzilla's rampage threatens to destroy Tokyo, and Japan uses all of its military might to stop him. And that's when the real conflict of the story is introduced. We've got America on one side of the table, Russia on the other, and Japan's caught in the middle. Each of them demand that the Japanese Prime Minister allow them to use nuclear weapons on Godzilla, but the Prime Minister doesn't waver in his decision not to. This line from the Prime Minister here really summarizes what the message of the film is.
もしあなた方の国アメリカとソ連にゴジラが現れたらその時あなた方は首都ワシントンやモスクワでためらわずに核兵器を使える勇気がありますかと。
No matter how terrible the threat is, using nuclear weapons is never the answer. Alright, so you can't use nukes on Godzilla, how are you gonna get rid of him? Easy. Just trick him into a volcano and blow him up. After his reintroduction, Godzilla got back to doing what he does best, wiping the floor with other kaiju. He fought Mothra again, King Ghidorah again, Mechagodzilla again, and even a couple new kaiju like Space Godzilla. 2016 saw another return to form with Shin Godzilla, and it's arguably the best movie in the franchise. And I mean arguably, fight me in the comments. Shin Godzilla is a remake of The Return of Godzilla in a lot of ways. Remember the journalist Goro Maki from Return of Godzilla that nobody would listen to? Yeah, we didn't either, that was like 12 movies ago, but Toho brings him up again as a way to say that this movie has once again retconned everything between The Return of Godzilla and now. Shin Godzilla starts the same way all the most sobering Godzilla movies do, with the crew of a ship mysteriously vanishing, but after that it goes in a bold new direction. This movie takes a series of back-to-back-to-back boardroom meetings and makes it one of the most exciting films I saw in 2016. Instead of representing the threat of nuclear weapons, in this movie, Godzilla very overtly represents the nuclear disaster in Fukushima and how poorly the government responded. Godzilla first makes himself known by emitting some seismic disturbances in Tokyo Bay, and right after that, we cut to our first boardroom meeting.
幹事長との面談はキャンセルとし、5分後にレクを始めさせていただきます。
羽田空港も万が一を考えて全便欠航として。
では基本的対処方針をまとめて直ちに関係閣僚会議を開きます。よろしいですね、総理。分かった。では皆さん、大会議室に集まってください。
Meanwhile, Godzilla has come on land and he's rapidly evolving into a bigger and bigger problem. Back to the boardroom.
それより第76条の武力攻撃と解釈して防衛出動の方が武器使用に対応しやすいんじゃないか。
武力攻撃と解釈するのは難しい。76条では武力攻撃を加えてくる主体を国または国に準ずるものと想定している。防衛出動は出せない。
今はそんなことを議論している時じゃないだろう。直ちに災害緊急事態の布告の宣言をお願いします。
Back to Godzilla. Back to the boardroom.
いたずらに不安を煽ることになります。
行政が避難指示を出す占領地でもない。
形式的な会議は極力排除したいが、会議を開かないと動けないことが多すぎる。
Back to Godzilla. And so on.
一方的な注文ばかりだな。
It feels like the makers of this movie saw a ton of Godzilla films and just thought,
there's no way you could perpetrate that amount of carnage and mayhem and not incur a considerable amount of paperwork.
The movie expertly skirts the line of condoning and condemning how the government responded to Fukushima by highlighting the struggles of modern democracy. Other than that, it gave us probably the coolest shot of Godzilla we're ever gonna get. Awesome. In the end, the nation rallies together to do what must be done, and they stop Godzilla. By freezing him, I guess? As of 2020, Shin Godzilla is the last live-action Godzilla movie produced in Japan, and it's a note they can proudly end on. Toho had brought Godzilla into the world over 60 years prior, and the two different kinds of Godzilla films had each met their natural conclusion a few times over. We saw Godzilla as a symbol of the threat of bombs and nuclear radiation here, here, and here. And we've seen him go all out in an ultimate kaiju brawl. Here, here, and here. That's the best of both worlds, and we got it 3 times. What more can you ask for? Or, more importantly, where can you go from there? If history serves as any example of what to expect, then we'll get another Godzilla movie within the next 10 years. Whenever Japan reintroduces Godzilla after a long break, they've always used him as a metaphor for some national threat necessitating a need for change, rather than making a movie about kaiju battle royales. So likely the next time we see Godzilla, he'll embody some sort of national or global fear that the people of Japan can relate to. Who knows, maybe something big will happen in 2020 that'll inspire another film. Until then, we'll just have to wait patiently for his return. Boom!
Oh, here it comes.
These guys got nothing on you, Godzilla. Go get him.
Oh, I love this one.
You gonna take that from him?
Oh man, that one's ugly.
There it is!
Show him who's boss. Ooh, yeah, get him.
Oh, yeah, oh.
Ooh, that had to hurt.
Don't call it a comeback!